kindness. So, kindness is an interesting thing. And kindness in these times is really important. And turning our awareness to that is crucial right now. Um, we all need it. And people need to receive it, such as a kindness of someone, you know, being so thoughtful as to prepare something and bring it and offer it to people. It's a beautiful kindness. Feel what it's like to receive that. Feels really good, doesn't it? Yeah. It will also feel good for other people when you do things like that, especially right now. And that will change how you feel about the day, the situation, what's going on. No matter what your point of view is in it, it will help shift it and change it. And one of the tenets of Buddhism is that we are innately kind. And I had this discussion actually with a professor at UCLA earlier today at the SIT, where she was talking about in Western tradition, there's an assumption that we are above good and evil. But in the Buddhist tradition, that's not so. The assumption is that we're inside is goodness and kindness, and that's where we come from. And it's an interesting comparison there. I don't know. I've done my own research on the literature about the comparison, but it's an interesting idea because if that is true, and I think it is true from my experience, now is the time to let that emerge. And it's interesting that things will trigger it in you, and just to be open to that and see how it changes you. You know, maybe just a smile, maybe something subtle that you don't expect, but that'll be there. Kindness becomes really important because then kindness, the way we talk about the heart practices, the Brahma Viharas, kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, kindness is the basis. And this kindness that is innate to us is the place we come from, the place we live from. It's our intention in the world is to be kind. And we take that on. And then from that, then when this kindness along the journey meets suffering, it blossoms into compassion. And with compassion, then we have this quivering of the heart. And when you see suffering, I actually, for a long time, I've been a therapist for a long time, but I still feel it in situations where I'll see somebody and the gravity of their suffering will really hit me. And it actually happens. I can actually feel this quivering in my chest. And it's this awakening of something. And in those moments, I know it's who we are. And that's a natural response. Now there's, mirror neurons and all these things that are clicking off in there too. And it's natural. So interestingly enough, if kindness is bumping along and it runs into something that's really great, then sympathetic joy blossoms, which is this beautiful joy that has no jealousy, no envy, no want. It's truly, truly happiness in someone else's experience. And the joy in that of being able to be present for somebody else's happiness without any need to take it over or to have it for yourself or other things. It's really quite wonderful. And then there's equanimity. And equanimity acts as a balance for all of us. And equanimity has an intellectual way of looking at it where it's like, oh, yeah, it's that being calm and not reactive and, being steady. If you drop a little bit more into the heart, equanimity is about being present with the wisdom that you learn through your heart. And equanimity doesn't exist without kindness and compassion. The gates to equanimity are kindness and compassion. And the risk that sometimes people worry about with equanimity is, well, if I get really equanimous, then I'm just going to be okay with everything. And it can just happen and I'll be fine. I'll just, sit. And that's not true. That's not true. That's indifference. And indifference is the near enemy of equanimity because it's a feeling like it, but it isn't it. Because equanimity has lots of heart in it and lots of caring at it. but it's realistic. It's realistic. And oddly enough, with equanimity, the far enemy of equanimity is is malice, right? Because that really is what the other side of that equation is. From indifference is actual malice. Um, so within that, equanimity has this quality of being able to keep us in a place where we don't go off the rails, loaded in drowning in the emotion of compassion, which can happen. And we also don't let kindness go off into an area where it kind of starts to be about us and not about the other. So equanimity helps that. So in these times, these things are actually really important because that balance is important for us. And it's a heart balance, it isn't a head balance. It's actually feeling into the place of wisdom. But it all starts with kindness. And it is so important that that kindness begin with yourself and what you can do to be kind to yourself. You know, we're not raised to do this. It's just not the way we grew up. You know, some of you it is, and I love you. Most of us it isn't. Some of you had fabulous parents that we should have cloned, but for most people it isn't true. It's just not the way the society works. You know, you have to push, you have to drive, you have to be on top of it. You have to keep criticizing yourself because if you don't, you're not going to make it. You're not going to get there. You're not going to get what you need. It's exhausting to think about, right? And in doing that, we forget that in order for us to be truly kind, we have to feel like we're being treated kindly. And that really does come from us. And so to think about what you need, what kindness do you need to show yourself? In this time period, is it turning off the TV, the internet, not looking at Instagram, you know, abstaining from Facebook for a while? You know, what is it that would work for you or that you need? You know, there's a real quality obsession that kicks in, and that is unkind. A lot of people in a situation like we're going through um, are frightened. And when we're frightened, it triggers this part of our brain that's more reptilian. And when that reptilian part of the brain is triggered, we end up in flight, fright, freeze syndrome. The thing that's been interesting is in the past 24 hours, almost everyone I've talked to has said, I'm obsessed with looking at this, or I can't stop doing this, or I keep thinking about this. The interesting thing about that is diagnostically, if you look at that, that's a symptom of freeze. It's rumination. And rumination is a part of freeze in fight, flight, or freeze. So, and that's an interesting thing. And the thing about that, to take it a step further, is that within this study that we actually do here too, mindful self compassion, the opposite of freeze and the rumination is, guess what? Mindfulness. So it's to be able to let your mindfulness be your friend so that you actually see this is what's happening. I'm obsessing, I'm ruminating, whatever term fits for you if you're doing it. Just see it, just give it a name and see what happens. That's a kindness to yourself. Having feelings or having experiences without taking a step back and allowing yourself to be mindful of your experience is kind of a little rough on yourself. It's that not being willing to stop and validate. And it's interesting because with people you love, would you ever do that? No, you'd validate their experience. You'd let them know that you see them, that you hear them, that you understand them. And if you think of those times when people have actually been able to look at you, to name your experience and to validate, what does it feel like for you? Did something shift inside when that happened? Did it feel different for you? That's the kindness you can start to give to yourself, is to see it and to name it. So, and there's a little saying that goes with that for mindful self-compassion, which is if you can name it, you can tame it, which may be true for you or not. But the idea I like, which is just being able to label something. Now, physiologically, actually, there's evidence in research that shows when you name something that's in the experience, the way you process it in your mind changes. It actually shifts places in your brain that you're processing it. So there is some evidence to back up the experience. So give yourself that kindness. Give yourself that kindness. And then, of course, compassion. And if there's ever a time when we needed compassion, this is it, right? If you're feeling it right now, you know, I know that there's fear rising in me, you know. Um, I'm looking at my life and I'm very out in my world. I'm very queer in my world, in my job, my home, my relationship. And then there's a certain amount of fear that goes with it in a time like this because I hear voices of hate out there. And the only way to really navigate that is to bring compassion to myself and to show up for myself in that and to know that I deserve it, which takes the ability to understand that the things that I was taught about that earlier on are not true. And to listen to actually the words of the Buddha. So when I was in the meditation, when I said no one deserves compassion more than you and no one less, that's actually from the Buddha. And people just don't usually quote the second part. They just quote the first. There's two parts. So, but to take those words to heart, you know, and the Buddha lived in a time with a very stratified culture. And one of the gifts of the Buddha in that culture was to treat everyone equally. Think how radical that was 2,600 years ago in a caste system where there were actually people who were called untouchables. We have our own today, for sure. But think about that. Think about that radical part with that. And think about then that bringing compassion to yourself, especially if you feel marginalized by the comments, the arguments, the dialogue that's going on in the country right now. Think about the power, the fierce compassion of being compassionate to yourself, because that's what goes away. That's what gets pulled away from by the dialogue when we start to listen to it. Bring that home. Know that you deserve the compassion because you truly do. The only gates to compassion that are necessary are struggle, challenge, suffering. That's it. So the way to do that is first acknowledge your own experience, validate it, name it, and then know that you are not the only person who is experiencing it, that you are part of humanity. And when that urge to isolate, which is natural, comes in and you pull in around it, know that that's a response. It's a conditioned response. And there's a choice. And the choice is to realize that you are not alone. even though it feels like it and you have been trained to think that way as a protective feature in many ways. But the truth is, you are part of this world and you are part of the humanity of this world. And the third is to be kind to yourself. The way you speak with yourself, the languaging, the tone of voice. Say to yourself what you need to hear. What do you need to hear? And to give yourself a moment so that what you need to hear arises. And then just be your own best friend and whisper it to yourself. So, acknowledging your experience, validating it, naming it, acknowledging the fact that your tendency pulls toward isolation when in fact your experience is much larger than that. And many, many people, you could fill Dodger Stadium easily with people who feel the way you do. Guaranteed. You'd fill all the stadiums in town with it and still have lines in the street. And then the third is that sense of just the kindness, the source of everything, because it comes back to that. It really does. And there's a wonderful poet who writes about kindness, and she talks about how, in order to feel kindness and experience it, sometimes it's as if you have to lose everything. Because you have to lose everything sometimes to realize the size of the cloth of sorrow in the world and just how big it is. Because when you do see the size of sorrow in the world, you suddenly realize there's nothing left but kindness. That's all there is. That is all there is.